The message of Zechariah. I've reached the 7th presentation in this series, and in this presentation I'm going to be focusing on chapters 10 and 11, and I've entitled this God's Love and Care. The message of Zechariah. God's love and care. In the last presentation we saw a picture of the characteristics of the reign of God. When God is reigning as king, he brings peace. His presence amongst us is very real. Lives and communities are restored. And because we were made for God, when we're under his authority, there is celebration and joy and happiness and fulfillment. And God is seeking to reach out to the world. But he does that through us. The characteristics of the reign of God. Now Zechariah pictures this as God's possibilities. But like so often, God's possibilities, we've got to look at the fine print and see what are the conditions. We have to play our part. We can't do it just in any old way that we fancy. And we saw in the last presentation this remarkable verse, so often quoted. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Jesus is coming to us. The question is, are we going to accept him as the one who is righteous, does it God's way, who's victorious, who's won the battle on the cross, but as the servant king? Too often in our Christian and religious communities, we plan, we design, we run things our own way, and then we ask God to rubber stamp it. Jesus is coming to us as our king. He is the king. And the question is whether we are accepting him as our king, and we're doing it his way, listening to him, throwing out our agendas and following his direction. When Jesus came into Jerusalem, in a sense fulfilling this picture, he came to his people, but his people wouldn't accept him as king. They wouldn't accept him as the righteous and victorious one. The whole concept of a servant king was rejected by the leadership of his day. God's conditions were not fulfilled, and God's possibilities never happened. The choice is ours, as it was theirs. The choice is yours, right now. If you want to see God's possibilities, look at God's conditions and take Jesus as your king and do it his way. Now that was the last presentation. We're now moving on into chapter 10 and the beginning of chapter 11. In all of this, human leadership is critical. Divine leadership is essential. We've got to take Jesus as our king in practical terms, listening to him, doing it his way, not just asking him to rubber stamp our religious agenda. And the answer that Zechariah pictures for us is human leaders who they themselves are led by God. Now, if you're a leader, it's very easy for you to say, God led me to. That costs nothing. How sure are you that God is actually leading you? So often God leads by leading groups together. We have the checks and safeguards on each other. We work together. And I challenge human leaders in God's people today to ask the question, are they following their agendas thinking that they're led by God? Or are you really being led by God? Are you really allowing Jesus to be the king, the servant king? Zechariah pictures the results. The people wander like sheep, oppressed for lack of a shepherd. In those days the sheep did follow the shepherd. They even recognized the shepherd's voice. Here they're wandering. For the Lord Almighty will care for his flock, the people of Judah, and make them like a proud horse in battle. From Judah will come the cornerstone, from him the tent peg, from him the battle bow, from him every ruler. Wonderful picture. In fact, a wonderful set of 4 pictures. The proud war horse, strong, a key resource for battle, spiritual battle. That's what God will provide to God's people if we will just accept it. A cornerstone, the stability, the rock solid foundation. A picture of God's people. The tent peg, utterly bringing security and reliability. The battle bow, the means of defeating the enemy. Now, we're not talking about physical warfare, we're talking about spiritual pictures here. This is the picture that Zechariah has given to us, as he so often does. He does it in picture terms. From Judah. Of course, in a sense, Jesus fulfilled all of this. But you can put it back and say, from the people of God. These are the characteristics of the people of God. Because the Lord Almighty will care for his flock. They've now got a shepherd. And when we follow the true shepherd, these things start to become true. Let's look at the land of Judah again, and let's look at it in a wider picture. There's the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, the Arabian Desert, just to the top of the Gulf and the top of the Red Sea. Much of it is desert. But very roughly, that area of land has got some sort of fertility, either because rivers are producing the water to feed the land, or because there is some rainfall. So there's some sort of fertility, called the Fertile Crescent. In that was the original land given to the people of Israel under Joshua. Of that, all that's left is Judah, a small portion of the land. This tiny, insignificant people in a tiny, insignificant part of the world. But it's in a critical part of the world, because this is the bridge between Africa, Europe, and Asia. This is where the trade routes come. This is where communication goes. This is a connecting point. It is strategic. God's people are put in strategic positions to influence those around. And that was true for Judah. But under attack. Attack from the south. Egypt looked upon the land and tried to take it over. Attack from the north and the northeast. Assyria wiped out the northern kingdom, and then Babylonia wiped out the Assyrians and wiped out Judah. People came in from the desert areas, looking for a better way of life, economic migrants, and people moved south from the area that we now know as Lebanon, moving south and infiltrating upon God's people, always under attack. We need God's love and care and protection. And Zechariah sees that, though I scattered them among the peoples, yet in distant lands they will remember me. They and their children will survive, and they will return. The people have been scattered. The southern kingdom have been scattered into Babylonia. Now they are beginning to come back, move back to their homeland. And wherever the people of God have been scattered, they will remember me. They will survive. And they will return, not only physically, but return to serve God and worship and learning from the scattering. God's love and care are there for his people, no matter what the circumstances are. And godly leadership always draws God's people back to unity and security. Just stop and ponder. The great moves of God, the communities of God's people that are thriving and expanding, marked out by godly leadership, bringing unity and security. But the ultimate is the leadership that Jesus brings. For he alone can bring true unity and security. Important principle. How important leadership is. Zechariah has already addressed it. He's returning to it in this section. It's so important for God's people. And the answer, as I said at the start, human leaders led by God. And how critical it is that human leaders are led by God. Not the ones who think they are led by God, but the ones who really are led by God, whose agenda is God's agenda. Moving on to the rest of chapter 11. Here we have a story in 3 parts. A picture of false shepherds. The false shepherds, this leadership exploits the people and exploits the land. Zechariah identifies as a shepherd. And as it were, we're seeing the shepherd rejected through his eyes. Leadership is rejected. How often good leadership is rejected. And evil shepherds take over. But that kind of leadership finds itself rejected by God. Now there are broad principles here, but there also are detailed things that actually occurred at the time that Jesus came and shortly afterwards. We can see it from 2 perspectives. The broad principle, the specific fulfillment in the days of Jesus and the decades that followed. Let's start with our false shepherds. Their buyers slaughter them and go unpunished. Those who sell them say, "Praise the Lord, I am rich." Their own shepherds do not spare them. Them is feminine, meaning the ewes. For I will no longer have pity on the people of the land, declares the Lord. I will give everyone into the hands of their neighbors and their king. They will devastate the land, and I will not rescue anyone from their hands. Picture of false shepherds. The false shepherds are in it for what they can get for themselves, to make money. And they slaughter the sheep. The people don't matter. The people's welfare doesn't matter. People's happiness doesn't matter. Their spiritual direction doesn't matter. The leaders are in it for what they can get out of it. And the picture is of them selling sheep, even selling the ewes, which are always kept for breeding. Selling the ewes, killing them off, making money. Oh, how often this is the case. And it was in the times that followed, where the leadership of God's people were on the make, in it for themselves. And God says, I will no longer have pity on the people of the land. That's the way they've gone. That's the way they've chosen. I will give everyone into the hands of their neighbors and their king. They will devastate the land, and I will not rescue anyone from their hands. Before the exile, this picture is just about exactly precise. After the exile, it drifted back to that, so that at the time of the days of Jesus, so much of the spiritual leadership was in it for themselves. And the people who were to be led didn't really matter. They were there to be exploited, and the whole thing would fall apart. What a terrible picture. human leadership, spiritual human leadership, happy to see the led being exploited and destroyed. And if that goes on, in the end, God leads them to it. And the people in the land are devastated. They went into exile. Jerusalem was sacked. The cities round about were burned and flattened. The temple was knocked down and decimated. And innocent people suffered terribly. What a responsibility in human leadership to do it God's way and not to be on the make for themselves. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I will take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone. I will gather them from all around and bring them back into their own land. I will make them one nation in the land on the mountains of Israel. There will be one king over all of them, and they will never again be two nations or be divided into two kingdoms. That's not from the book of Zechariah. That was said shortly before this, and it was said by Ezekiel. He was a prophet who was with the exiles in the Babylon area. And he is showing God's plan, that God would take them out of exile and bring them back into the land and unify them. He goes on, they will no longer defile themselves with their idols and vile images or with any of their offences. For I will save them from all their sinful backsliding, and I will cleanse them. They will be my people, and I will be their God. What a beautiful picture of possibilities. My servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd. They will follow my laws and be careful to keep my decrees. They will live in the land I gave to my servant Jacob, the land where your ancestors lived. They and their children and their children's children will live there forever, and David my servant will be their prince forever. Now Ezekiel is beginning to grasp something bigger. Someone from the line of David would be king over them forever and would enable them to live good lives in total security. And of course, with hindsight, we know that was Jesus. Ezekiel goes on, I will make a covenant of peace with them. It will be an everlasting covenant. I will establish them and increase their numbers, and I will put my sanctuary among them forever. My dwelling place will be with them. I will be their God, and they will be my people. Followers of Jesus experience the covenant of peace with our Maker. And it's permanent. And God is with us. And God will multiply the followers of Jesus. And he will live within the community of those who are following Jesus. He will be their God. And the people will be his people. A beautiful picture that Ezekiel saw. That's the possibility. That's what God wants. And then the nations will know that I, the Lord, made Israel holy, when my sanctuary is among them forever. When God's people, when we're living like that, we have an impact on all those around. That's God's plan. It was God's plan for the exiles to be returned, to be restored, to have this perfect and wonderful king forever, in unity of purpose, harmony, security, and to influence and have an impact for God on the nations round about. You'll find that in Ezekiel chapter 37. Zechariah paints a somewhat different picture, writing quite a bit later. Ezekiel's picture is so positive. This is what God wants. He wants them restored from exile to unity in the land, ruled by one king. No more of this idolatry and false worship, but security, peace, and growth in the land. All good. And God would be their God. They would be his people. And there would be an impact on the ethnic groups all around. That's God's intention for the exiles that Ezekiel brought to them when they were in the Babylon area. It's God's intention for God's people, you and me, wherever we are. Security, under the lordship of Jesus, serving Him alone. He is a top priority spot, living in a total spiritual security and peace, growing in numbers and depth. God real to us. We are His people. And us having an impact on all the people around, positively, drawing people to Jesus. That's God's intention. Now hold that in mind as I fade it out and we look at what Zechariah said. He said this quite a while later. So I shepherded the flock marked for slaughter. So Zechariah has become the shepherd, identifying as the leader, particularly the oppressed of the flock. And I took 2 staffs and called one favor and the other union, and I shepherded the flock. In 1 month I got rid of the 3 shepherds. The flock detested me. And I grew weary of them and said, I will not be your shepherd. Let the dying die, the perishing perish. Let those who are left eat one another's flesh. And I took my staff called favor and broke it, revoking the covenant I had made with all the nations. It was revoked on that day, and so the oppressed of the flock who were watching me, they knew it was the word of the Lord. I told them, if you think it best, give me my pay, but if not, keep it. So they paid me 30 pieces of silver. And the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter, the handsome price at which they valued me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them to the potter at the house of the Lord. And I broke my second staff called union, breaking the family bond between Judah and Israel. You'll find that in Zechariah chapter 11. How do we square these 2 pictures? This one is so completely different. The people rejecting the shepherd and the whole thing falling apart. And the shepherd leaving the oppressed, leaving the people to go their own way. Ezekiel pictured what God wanted to happen. Zechariah pictures what was going to happen. God was going to come to be the good shepherd. The false shepherds would be challenged. But sadly, most of the people and their leaders rejected the good shepherd. So God revokes the mission and destiny of Israel. And God destroys the unity of His people. And the good shepherd is sold for a pittance. Can you see how the life and ministry of Jesus fits this pattern? God sent Jesus into the world, descended from the kingly line, to be the good shepherd. Jesus Himself describes Himself as the good shepherd in John 10. God sent Jesus. And just by the very presence of Jesus and what He did and said, the false shepherds were challenged. The religious leaders of the day were challenged. They rejected Jesus in general, and the people just followed. They wanted to hang on to the religious system, and they weren't listening to what God was saying. How often that happens. But in the days of Jesus, the result was that the whole mission and destiny of Israel was finished. And you just have to look at the teaching of Jesus towards the latter part of any of the gospel stories. Take, for example, Matthew. Take, for example, the picture of the fig tree that was cursed. Jesus uses that as an illustration. A nation that refused to go the way of God. Eventually God says, right, you can go your own way. And their unity was destroyed. And the nation was wiped out. Because the Romans sacked the nation in the great wars that led up to AD 70, when Jerusalem was destroyed and flattened. And the Good Shepherd, Jesus, he was sold for a pittance. 30 pieces of silver. The most wonderful person that has ever walked this planet was betrayed and sold for a pittance. And willingly he accepted it, and he accepted that he would be tortured to death on a Roman cross. That's what would happen. Compared to Ezekiel's picture of what could have happened. And the choice is still there for us. I summarize this in the terms of the people of Israel. God's intention that a leader descended from the line of David would give them that gentle, firm leadership, bringing them together in unity. The people would live rich lives in security. They'll be living the way God intended them to live. And when we live God's way, it's not restrictive. It's rich and it's wonderful and it's fulfilled. God knows us best. God will be at the very center of our lives, providing everything we need. And as a result, the people groups round about would be influenced and drawn to God through God's people. That's the story, the picture that Ezekiel paints of God's intention. But that's what was going to happen. The leadership of the people of God in Judah eventually went into self-serving leadership. And they weren't interested in any leadership that God provided. They were only interested in lining their own pockets, their reputation, their status, their position, their wealth, their position in society, and they regarded the ordinary folk as rubbish. And the led would reject going God's way and following God's leader. Yes, many came to Jesus and followed him. But many came and listened. They weren't wanting to be disturbed by the truth. They wanted it their way. And the people who were suffering in the land, they were the ones who were aware of what God was doing. How often that is the case. The people who were sick, ill, hurting, damaged, they came to Jesus. As Jesus said, the people who are not ill don't come to the doctor. But in the end of the day, God would remove this leadership. Jesus went to the cross. He died and was buried. God raised him and then took him out of Jerusalem back to the Galilee in the north. And the leadership, the spiritual leadership of the nation, the secular political leadership of the nation was allowed to do what it wanted. And the people went on their own way. And within a lifespan, there was a massive revolt. And the Romans had had enough. And if you look at this Roman campaign, one of the most violent campaigns the Romans ever conducted, with brutal efficiency, hundreds of thousands of Jewish men were crucified, death by torture. Women were raped. Pregnant women were ripped open. The people were fleeing. The cities were destroyed. Jerusalem was surrounded and besieged, captured, burnt to the ground. The whole temple was flattened. Jesus predicted all this would happen. Sadly, it did. Because the people, and their leaders particularly, wouldn't listen to what God was doing. There's an inevitability. If we push God out and decide to run things our own way, there's a kind of an inevitable consequence that happens. And this is one example of it. tragically. You see, the fulfillment of the Ezekiel picture is conditional on our cooperation. Don't for a moment in your Christian group imagine that God will just do it all. If people have brought prophecies to you about your group, listen carefully, but look at the fine print. What are the conditions? And the conditions again and again are that when Jesus comes, we accept him as Lord, and we do it his way, and we take him as the Good Shepherd. He knows best. He will equip, he will empower, he will enrich. But so often, the leaders and the led, we have our agendas, our programs, the way we want things to be done. It may be good, it may not be good, but it's not the way of Jesus. Fulfillment is conditional on our cooperation. Shepherds in those days had two pieces of equipment. One was used for defense and one was used for gently guiding the sheep. And that's the model and the picture that's being used here. They were called grace and favor. This is defined and described as the covenant with all the nations, and the union one is described as the brotherhood between Israel and Judah. If I put it in modern terms, we could see it this way. God rules us graciously. The nations don't deserve it. Judah didn't deserve it. We don't deserve it. You can't earn it. It's only God's favor. He comes to us and offers this to us. And when he does, he brings unity. The two things come together beautifully. But when we reject the Good Shepherd, we lose these things. I've summarized it like that. When God's people follow God's shepherd, there'll be unity and there'll be impact. That's the outcomes. That's the way it goes. God in his graciousness and goodness offers to be our good shepherd. Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. When we listen to his voice and follow his ways, as he said in John 10, the results are just wonderful. But far too often we don't. Or we pretend we are, when really we're following our own agenda. Great principle here. And this valuable God-appointed leadership that Jesus came to offer was dispensed with for a small sum of money. He who is of infinite value. And the man who got the money never even got the benefit of it. Oh, how easy it is for this to happen to us. Good leadership. People who are really good. God leadership, and thank God we have many who are wonderful leaders, who are dedicated to the welfare of the led. Very often these people are undermined by self-serving leadership. And very often that self-serving leadership is supported by the majority of the led. Oh, how often I have seen this in Christian communities and churches. How the good leadership almost dies of frustration, as there are other people in leadership whose only interest is particularly their power or reputation. They're not really interested in the welfare of the led. They have got an agenda for themselves, but they curry favor and get support. And the good leadership is undermined and rejected, and sometimes driven out. And how often I've seen when people have come to the end of a term of leadership in a church, they won't allow themselves to be put forward for another term to serve God's people, because they've been driven crazy by self-serving leadership that's pursuing its own agenda and undermines all they're seeking to do for the welfare of the led. There's a deep principle here. We've got to look at our leadership structures, and we've got to look at the quality. We need teaching on this, because the leadership of God's people is so critical. And in the Western churches, we are being denied so much that's good. Good leadership is being driven to the edge by self-serving leadership. In churches and Christian communities of all types and shapes and descriptions. And the people that suffer are the led. But the led have got to stand up and be counted and taught how to discern what is good leadership, so that the self-serving leadership is marginalized, not the reverse. A great message for today. That is true. Good leadership is always available. God will provide it for his people. And good leadership will bring that. Protection, provision, direction, unity. And all of that will mean that the group grows. It will outreach. It will bless those in the community around. But very often, that good leadership, God leadership, is rejected. And who suffers? We all suffer. When you push God out, when you push God away, God doesn't force himself upon us. He lets us have our way. The consequences are dreadful. And the picture that Zechariah has brought is of this God leadership, perfect leadership, tossed away for a paltry sum of money. Godly leadership is of infinite value. And God's infinite leader, Jesus, his value is even greater. And the self-seeking human leadership that you could see so vividly in the days of Jesus, they would reap the rewards of their self-seeking aims. And the tragedy was the whole nation went down with them, wiped out forever. The temple gone forever. The impact and the task that Ezekiel pictured for them gone forever. Yes, Jesus drew unto himself people who moved out from this leadership. And that was the foundations of God's people in the world today. God's love and care is there for us. But there are conditions. Are we prepared to respond to his leadership? Or are we still going our own way, pretending that we're listening to him? Jesus is so often rejected in the world. That generates chaos. And the history of the world shows it. And we humans are responsible for that. And the loss to us is just dreadful. That's the contrast. That's what Jesus offered when he said, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. I lay down my life for the sheep. In those days the sheep followed the shepherd and followed his voice. That was the way shepherding was done. And the shepherd was prepared to put his life on the line to save the flock. Jesus literally laid down his life for us and for other sheep outside the people of God of that day. And you can see the fulfillment of that. And there'll be one flock, one shepherd listening to his voice. That's what he offers. That is the prospect. Oh, my friends, let us not miss the boat. Let us not kid ourselves in what we're doing. And let's get back on our knees as God's community and say, please, Lord, speak and help us to listen and to do it your way. We throw out our agendas. We want you, Jesus, to be the shepherd, the leader, the one who walks ahead of us, whose voice we hear. In the next presentation, I'm going to look at what Zechariah says about God's answer.